Hello and welcome to this introduction to the native pinewood and juniper scrub habitat. I'm Ben Averis and I've written this document here with a load of pictures and things, and we'll be going through it. It's a kind of illustrated tour through this habitat. So here's a picture of it. As you can see, it's a rather dark looking scene there. That's why I've written this wee poem. Okay, the winters are cold and flowers are few. The pine trees are old and the feeling is blue. Juniper leaf, dark as can be, needle of grief on a wretched wee tree. Juniper, pine, trees of the place where the sun don't much shine and the wind chills your face. It'll frost, it'll freeze, even summer's not warm. No help of these trees in the darkening storm. To the pines in the heather you go at a price, for the murk and the weather are not very nice. To enjoy the old pines in the shivering cool is one of the signs of a miserable fool. So, I'm not saying you're miserable fools, by the way. It's just a bit of fun. I quite enjoy writing miserable poems. I think I enjoy writing miserable poems more than happy ones. Okay, now we're going to have a look, starting at seeing how this habitat is defined. So, it's important, one of the reasons for doing these presentations is to help people classify the habitats to the right type. This one's quite an easy habitat to tell, actually, because it comes in two forms. One is dominated by native pine trees. That's the native Scots pine woodland we find in the Scottish Highlands. Pretty easy to recognise, really, because as long as you know what Scots pine looks like, and it's a very, very typically heathy kind of habitat because it grows on acid soils. So we find things like heather and blaeberry growing under pine trees. We can get some broadleaf trees growing with it, like birches, rowan, some willows sometimes, but they make up only a small proportion of the canopy. We can actually, in the same parts of the country as those where we get the native pine, we can find plantations of Scots pine with a very similar kind of ground layer. And they are actually also included in this habitat type for one reason, because they have such similar vegetation, but also because in some cases it's actually not really clear when we're there to tell whether it's a plantation or not, especially for old plantations. So native pine is the one. Juniper scrub is the other form, which is quite distinctly, obviously very different. Distinct habitat. Juniper is an easy shrub to recognise, and it can form patches that can be quite dense, pretty unmistakable. It might look a bit like gorse scrub from a distance. Obviously it's easy to tell when we're closer, and it is similarly northern. Though it's not just in the Scottish Highlands, it also comes down into the southern uplands, northern England, like the Lake District and the North Pennines, and one or two other places. But it doesn't include the kind of juniper scrub that you get down in southern England on more calcareous or sandy soils. Different kind of vegetation, that is. Now we can take a look through the habitat types which you're perhaps most likely to confuse with the pine juniper habitat. I say perhaps most likely because maybe you're not very likely to confuse it with anything else, because pine and juniper, the distinct species, it's not very difficult habitat to identify, really. Anyway, broadleaf woodland is one possibility because you can get quite a lot of birch trees and a bit of other, like rowan and willow maybe, mixed in with pine and juniper. So one thing there is to just look and see if you can figure out which is the more dominant, which is has the more extensive canopy cover. And if you're in doubt, then looking at a bigger and bigger area to try and sort it out is one way. But it's also possible that as you look around, you might find that there are some quite decent sized patches where the birch is actually dominant in itself. So that might be little areas of broadleaf woodland. It might be a kind of mosaic of the two habitats, or an area that's sort of intermediate with an intricate mix of pine and birch, and then you just have to decide which one to plump for on the basis of the relative proportions of them. And likewise with juniper and birch. Heath is another one. And the reason why heath could potentially be confused with pine and juniper habitats is really because of the way it can sort of intergrade. It can sort of go in a very subtle way gradually from the one habitat to the other, from the heath to the pinewood, more to the pine than to the juniper. You can get a very gradual transition, and you can be in the middle of that somewhere and think, well, where do I draw the line? There's no hard and fast rule for doing that. Just have to decide if you're beneath and really among the pines, or if you're out in a bit of adjacent open heath. Of course, the ground layer of the pine woodland tends to be heathy as a general rule, so two habitats have got a lot in common. With juniper scrub, the patches tend to be a bit more sharply delineated, so I think you're less likely to find yourself wondering whether this is juniper scrub or heath, because the juniper scrub is often so dense, and then pretty sharp edge, and then heath on the other side, or sometimes grassland. You can find it mixed with grassland. This pine is really the one that can grade out so much more gradually, and at the bottom there's another picture of pine opening out into wetter ground, bog and wet heath. Just as in the case of dry heath, they can grade very gradually into pine woodland. Pine in other parts of the country outside the Highlands, such as this one here, this bit of pine woodland just up the road from where I live in the Lammermuir Hills here, they can be quite nice, nice pine trees here, but we can't count this as the native pine habitat for obvious reasons. Likewise, we don't count juniper scrub that's down in the south on more neutral to calcareous or sandy soils down in southeast England. There's apparently there's quite a bit of juniper in some places. I've not actually seen it. I'd like to. That's why I haven't got a photograph of that here. One day, something to look forward to. See some of that. Some people might think that's a bit of a sad thing to look forward to, I suppose. But someone's got to be interested in these sort of things, haven't they? Really. And I suppose somebody's got to be interested in this stuff, which probably looks pretty boring to a lot of people. There's juniper there, kind of laid out flat. That's this is the dwarf juniper, different subspecies, growing in a place where it gets really windy quite a lot of the time. We can tell that because the vegetation is so short, and a lot of the stems of the dwarf shrubs like heather and bell heather are all growing sideways. Pretty inhospitable sort of climate in these places, and this is not the juniper scrub in the NPMS system. This this counts as heathland in the heathland habitat. In fact, that's at the montane subdivision of the heathland habitat, because it's a real montane to submontane kind of vegetation this is. And actually these juniper heaths are fantastic places. This is one of my favourite habitats, I must say. We can check out the main species that we're going to find in this habitat, starting with the trees and shrubs. And of course, Scots pine, that's pretty much the first species that comes to mind, isn't it, really? By far the most conspicuous species in the native pine wood, and the most defining species. So there's a couple of pictures I've done. Scots pine near Braemar, the colour one, and one in, where was it, the Blackwood of Rannoch, that black and white one. Juniper, I guess, is the next species that comes to mind in the pine and juniper habitat. And there's a photograph on the left, a close view of a bit of one of the twigs. You can see there the distinctive feature of the leaves all coming in whorls of three. They look a bit like the blades of a wind turbine, actually, in that kind of arrangement. Except the wind turbine's blades are much bigger. You're not going to confuse them. And I think the juniper leaves will end in a sharper point. The birch trees there, the downy birch and the silver birch, leaves different. The downy birch, the leaf tapers to a shorter point, and its edges have sort of what we call single teeth. They're all kind of more or less the same size. There's a bit of variation, but they don't differ in size as much as they do along the edges of the leaf of the silver birch. See how jaggy it is there on the silver birch. Also, the silver birch leaf the tip of the leaf is drawn out to a much longer and sharper point. The twigs of the downy birch are pretty hairy, at least when they're young, not so in the silver birch. Rowan has got leaves a bit like an ash leaf, but the individual leaflets are more shortly pointed. And of course, ash doesn't have those clusters of white flowers, and neither does it have the red berries that rowan will have later on. Rowan is a smaller tree, and it can be quite common, scattered through the pine and juniper habitat. Ash, actually, we're not really very likely to find in these sorts of places because it prefers more neutral to calcareous soils. And another thing to help, if in case you're ever confusing the two species, the leaves, the main leaves of ash trees are in opposite pairs along the twigs, whereas in rowan they're not. Birches again, just a quick look at the trunks, because the trunk of the mature silver birch is really quite distinct from that of the downy birch. See that grey trunk on the left with all these deep fissures running up and down? That's something that you don't really see like that in the downy birch. Downy birch picture on the right there, with some of that typical birchy, whitish, smoother bark with dark horizontal lines on it, interspersed in a kind of irregular, patchy way with just sort of other dark, broken up looking bark. It's a more irregular looking arrangement of colours and textures on the trunk of the downy birch, and indeed the branching shape of the whole tree in downy birch tends to be less regular than in silver birch. Silver birch can grow taller as well. See in the left hand picture there's some nice tall, upright, single-stemmed silver birches there. That's quite typical of what we see of that species in the central and eastern highlands. These things on this page, well, I shouldn't say things, these plants on this page, I should say, really, are dwarf shrubs. Dwarf shrubs are very, very common in this habitat, especially in the pinewood part of it, but in juniper as well. Juniper scrub, you can get them. The three species on the left are all kind of alike a little bit in that they've got very small leaves and they've got pinkish flowers. The ordinary heather on the left is the commonest of them all overall, really common species, with the tiniest leaves and the smallest and palest flowers. Flowers in a kind of narrow spike at the tips of the stems. Bell heather is different in that its leaves are longer and they come in whorls of 3, and the flowers are bigger and noticeably darker. And they come in a sort of spike, a short to medium length spike at the tip of the stem. Cross-leaved heath is a greyer looking species because its leaves have little white hairs along their edges, and the leaves are in whorls of 4 as opposed to whorls of 3 in the bell heather. Whorls being little groups like all leaves coming out from the same point on the stem. Flowers of cross-leaved heath are more bunched together in a very small, like a globular sort of cluster, and they're intermediate in darkness between those of the heather and the bell heather. Bell heather likes especially likes drier ground. Cross-leaved heath likes wetter ground. Ordinary heather goes right across from dry to pretty wet. Okay, moving right. Bilberry, or blaeberry as we call it here in Scotland. I think they call it whortleberry in southwest England. Maybe other names, I don't know. Anyway, it's got different leaves, totally different leaves, bigger and broader, with oval shape and teeth on their edges, and they fall off in the autumn, so they're not there in the winter. They can turn a nice red colour, by the way, in the autumn before they fall off. And they can actually start off with a reddish tinge in the spring when they first come out. It's got those little berries, of course, that we can eat in the late summer, those sort of dark bluey coloured berries. Very nice. So when the leaves have all fallen off and the berries are gone, of course, in the winter, we can still tell this from any other species except for broom. This is by its stems, which are green with those longitudinal ridges. Yeah, the only other thing really to have stems like that is broom, which is a much bigger bush, totally different. And if you're in any doubt that maybe it's broom seedlings that you're looking at, have a look on the ground and you'll find old leaves. It's always a good thing for trees as well, trees and shrubs and these kind of dwarf shrubs in the winter half of the year, sort of grovelling about there on the ground looking for leaves. Usually you'll find something that gives you a bit of a clue. Okay, cowberry is related to the bilberry. Leaves are about the same size, roughly the same shape, but they're dark and leathery, tough textured, and they're evergreen. and they don't have such prominent teeth along their edges. The berries go a kind of reddish colour. It's a more northern species, really, northern and upland. I mean, you do get it here and there in the southern half of Britain, but not so commonly. So that'll come into the pine and juniper habitats, although it's particularly common, even more, up in the hills, out in open heaths. Crowberry, similar distribution more or less actually to the cowberry. It likes these colder places. Its leaves are pretty narrow. The leaves are a bit like the leaves of bell heather really, but they're thicker, tougher texture, and they've got a white stripe running along the whole of the underside, so it's always really easy to tell crowberry. Has little berries as well that go blackish colour, which they're quite nice to eat actually. And you never hear much about people don't sort of sing the praises really of crowberries. I've never heard them doing that, but right, they've got a nice kind of crunchy sort of texture and tastes sort of okay. Ferns, these can be common in some of the native pine juniper habitats, though not as common and conspicuous generally as those dwarf shrubs we've just seen on the last page. Here are some that are NPMS positive indicators. Hard fern, pretty unmistakable actually. It's got leathery leaves, leathery a bit like those cowberry ones, evergreen, thick texture, and it's divided up not as intricately as some of the ferns we get, so they're just what you call single pinnate, and it forms these tufts. Quite palatable to sheep and deer as well actually, despite being thick and leathery. Oak ferns, beautiful delicate one that isn't tufted. You just get single fronds coming out of the ground from an underground creeping rhizome, and in that way it's a bit like bracken, which also has single fronds and then forms patches rather than extensive patches rather than discrete tufts. Oak fern likes generally rather acid ground, especially in upland areas. Lemon-scented fern on the right, that's a tufted fern, a bit like some of the other more familiar tufted ferns we might have, like male fern, scaly male fern, all very common. It is especially common in northern places, or where there's like on a north-facing slope where it's a bit cool or even slightly damp. It's double pinnate, so you can see those pinnae are divided again, but the secondary divisions are not really very toothed, scarcely toothed, whereas in things like male fern, scaly male fern, they're a bit more toothed. And as we go down towards the bottom of the frond, out of view of this photo, those side pinnae, the main side pinnae, continue and get shorter and shorter and shorter, very, very short ones down near the bottom. Some more ground-dwelling species in this habitat. All of them happen to be NPMS positive indicators here as well. Sweet vernal grass on the left, pretty easily recognisable flower head. It's not branched and it's got these rather long, shinyish green spikelets in it that turn a kind of pale golden colour later in the year, and they can sort of persist for quite a long time, which helps to recognise the species. The leaves are fairly ordinary, just a few millimetres across, but they taste of almonds, quite a pleasant almondy taste. It comes up quite early in the year, hence the name vernal grass. Wavy hairgrass, very different. An openly branched flower head, although when it first comes out those branches are held much closer to the main stem there, so it kind of looks long and narrow, but yeah, then they open out, showing these very thin wiry branches within the flower head, and they can be quite wavy. Maybe that's how it got its name, or maybe it's something to do with the way the individual little spikelets there would wave about when there's a bit of a wind. And those little spikelets have a nice sort of silvery, sometimes purple tinged colour about them, with a bit of a shine, a bit of a sheen. The leaves, by the way, in this species, wavy hairgrass, are really thin and wiry, no more than about a millimetre across, and they come in quite dense tufts. Wood anemone, unmistakable flowers. Nothing really much more needs to be said about those flowers, I think. The leaves are very deeply cut in a star-like pattern, a bit like some buttercups, But they occur in whirls of 3 up the stem. The stem will just come up and then suddenly be these 3 leaves out all from the same place, and then the flower on a separate stalk above that. You can also get individual wood anemone leaves carpeting the ground. Wood sorrel, very common on acid soils in woods, in all kinds of woods on acid soils really. Leaves a bit like clover leaves, except they don't have little distinctive teeth that you get along the edges of a lot of clover leaves. And the veins aren't as straight and numerous and sort of parallel to each other as they are in clovers. Obviously, you don't need to look at those features if you've got the flowers. These flowers you can see of wood sorrel, you're never going to confuse that with clover. In fact, clovers you're not really likely to find much in the woods anyway, especially on acid soils. Now, here's some more NPMS positive indicator ground layer species we can find in this habitat. Two on the left, or one on the left, one in the middle. Strawberries, wild strawberry, barren strawberry. Wild strawberry, actually neither of them are terribly plentiful in this habitat, but where they occur, you can have them as positive indicators. Wild strawberry is the one that has the red fruits, nice to eat. Barren strawberry never has those. If they both have trefoil leaves with 3 leaflets, but if you're ever in doubt, you can check out the hairs on the undersides of the leaflets, because in the wild strawberry the hairs are so closely pressed that you could be forgiven for thinking that it's a smooth undersurface of the leaf without any hairs at all. You have to look really quite close to see them. Whereas in the barren strawberry, the hairs stick out a lot more on the underside, and they're really pretty obvious. There are other differences. The wild strawberry has rather brighter green leaves, which tend to get a bit bigger as well than the leaves of the barren strawberry, whose leaves are rather a duller, slightly bluer green. Those 2 photos show that difference in colour actually. And the teeth, see the teeth at the edges of the leaf? You tend to get rather more teeth and more side veins actually on leaflets of the wild strawberry, and the final terminal tooth at the end of each leaflet tends to be a bit bigger and more sticking out forward than the one in barren strawberry, which is unusually small. Not a very grand way to end a leaflet. You've got these reasonable sized teeth going all the way along the edge, but then when it gets to the end, just a really small one, insignificant one. Funny sort of design that. Third one on the right, heath bedstraw, very common plant on acid soils in all kinds of places, in woods, heaths, grasslands. So not surprising to find it in the pine juniper habitat. It can be very common. A low-grown trailing little species with leaves, very small, narrow leaves in whorls of from 4 up to 8. It's got a smooth texture because the main stems don't have hairs on them, and the leaves do have little tiny hairs on their margins, but they point forwards. All of that contrasts with some other bedstraws in which the hairs point backwards on the leaves, and you get backwards pointing hairs on on stems, and that gives them a rough texture. So it's a very smooth texture bedstraw, is heath bedstraw. Very common. Here's a nice plant. I shouldn't sound so surprised saying that, because all plants are okay really, aren't they? But this one, chickweed wintergreen, it is an attractive little thing, and it's quite easy to recognise at any time, not any time of the year, because in the winter, middle of winter, it'll be died down really, but when it's up, even if you haven't got those easily recognisable white flowers, which come mostly just a single flower coming up on a stalk above the leaves, even if you haven't got the flower, you've got that whirl of leaves, 4 or 5 or so of them, coming out from the same point at the top of the stem, and then the flower stem going up above that. And in that whirl of leaves, the leaf size varies. Usually in plants that have leaves in whirls, in this country anyway, the leaves are more or less the same size, all the leaves in the whirl. But not so in this species. You can get really quite a big difference. See on the right hand photo of those nice pinky tinged autumn leaves, there's one right over on the right there which has got a really small leaf in the whirl. So quite a bit of variation. It's like somebody couldn't make their minds up, or I don't know, they were just putting them together with all bits of what they could find. That makes it easy to recognise. It's got a northeastern distribution in Britain, mainly these sort of colder parts of the country where it's cooler climates and not excessively rainy. And it's very common in a lot of the pine and juniper habitat. Three more NPMS positive indicators of this habitat. The one on the left, harebell, unmistakable looking flowers. Pretty common plant on dryish ground, on soils varying from acid to quite basic, really, in grasslands, in some heaths. It's not really very common in the pine juniper habitat, but where we get it, we can count it as a positive indicator. The leaves, which are not showing in that photo, they come in two forms. The leaves growing up the stems are really, really narrow, almost like miniature grass leaves. But the leaves at the bottom look more like kind of small violet leaves, totally different shape, heart-shaped, roundish to heart-shaped on a long stalk. Bitter vetch, it's a lovely vetch. It's compared with a lot of other vetches, its flowers and its leaves are not hugely numerous. Like some vetches have great long spikes of lots of flowers and leaves with lots and lots of little leaflets all arranged left and right along the central leaf stalk. Bitter vetch doesn't go big on numbers, only about 2 to 4 pairs of leaflets and flowers in groups of 2, maybe up to about 6, but often just sort of 2, 3. But it makes up for that because the leaflets, they're quite big and broad. Beautiful looking things. They can be a bit narrow, but where they're narrow they tend to be a bit long and enough length compared to other vetches. So there's some substance in it there. And the flowers, well, when they say a photograph speaks for 1,000 words, you know, that colour, see that colour. I'm not saying it's a brilliant photo, but it's a nice colour, isn't it? You know. One on the right, cow weeds. That can be pretty common in some of these places. These acid soils, pine, juniper, especially some of the pine woods, but actually not as common as in some of the broadleaved woods. It could be mistaken for greater stitchwort, which also has leaves rather narrow oval and in opposite pairs. But the greater stitchwort's leaves, they're a bit straighter looking, they're a bit greyer tinged, and the stems are kind of square sectioned in the greater stitchworts. And of course, if you've got flowers, the yellow ones here are pretty unmistakable. You'd only mistake those maybe for the flowers of the small cowweed, Melanparium sylvaticum, which is extremely rare. So let's not bother with that. The flowers of the greater stitchworts, by the way, are white, completely different to these yellow ones. 3 more ground-dwelling species that are also classed as NPMS positive indicators in this habitat. Which just reminds me, I forgot to mention when we looked at the page of dwarf shrubs that almost all of the dwarf shrubs on that page we had there some pages back were also NPMS positive indicators. The only one that wasn't was cross-leaved heath. Okay, common dog violet. This will be the commonest kind of violet that you will find in native pine and juniper habitat. The only other one that you're likely to find in those places will probably be the marsh violet, which grows in wetter places, wet ground, and has bigger, sort of broader, more rounded and rather paler green leaves than the sort of slightly dark heart-shaped leaves of common dog violet you can see in that photo. And its flowers are relatively small and a bit paler than those of common dog violet. So yeah, common dog violet is the most likely one. It tends to like rather dryish, well-drained ground. And it grows in other habitats too, of course, broadleaved woodland and even out in the open in sort of grasslands and heaths. And another thing about the common dog violet that helps with its identification is that pale coloured spur sticking out at the back of the flowers. For example, that will help to separate it from early dog violet, Viola reichenbachiana, which is paired with the species on the positive indicator list. But the early dog violet is a distinctly more southern species of mainly kind of more calcareous soils, really quite different habitat, different distribution. You're not really going to find it in the native pine and juniper habitat. Extremely unlikely find in those places. Uh, stone bramble. That's a nice thing that creeps around. Um, it's not very common. It's got a mainly upland distribution, and it's got leaves a bit like wild strawberry leaves, except the central leaflet, people call them terminal leaflet, but in fact it is terminal really in this species because it's on a separate stalk of its own that sticks out further from the pear just below it. And the leaf surface is a bit more kind of up and down in relation to the side veins, so you get a more of a kind of dark and light shade effect than you do in the wild strawberry. So yeah, you can always tell those two species apart. It's got red berries. The red berries are a bit more, the individual berries in them are bigger than the tiny little things you get in a wild strawberry, so the fruit doesn't look similar. In fact, it looks a bit more like a sort of a red berry bramble, a little bit maybe, but with the round individual berries a bit bigger and fewer. And the flowers are very like bramble flowers. It's related to bramble. It's in the same genus, Rubus. Common mouse ear, very, very common plant, especially in grasslands. Quite a wide range of grasslands, even some rather improved, agriculturally improved grasslands. But other habitats as well, woodland margins. Really, it's not really a woodland interior plant that much. You can get it, especially where there's a bit of light, a bit more light. It's perhaps a slightly surprising thing to find on the NPMS positive indicator list for the pine and juniper habitat, but it's there. So it's related to stitchworts. It's got little leaves in opposite pairs. They're hairy, the stems are hairy, and the flowers are smaller than typical ordinary like greater stitchwort flowers, but they've got those notched petals at the end, white flowers, 5 petals. It's not a very big plant, it doesn't grow that tall, so it's pretty easy thing to recognise. Short, hairy, opposite leaves, small oblong oval leaves. Okay, here's a couple of pages of rarer species, some kind of pinewood specialities, in fact some of them are. The common wintergreen starting on the left. It's not a very common plant really, it's a funny name for it. It's always a really good find. I'm pretty excited to find Pyrola minor whenever I see it. There's no reason why we shouldn't be pretty excited to see any plants, actually, even the very common ones. So it's got those rounded leaves of a fairly firm texture, and they're evergreen as well. And they've got quite long leaf stalks, but the leaf stalk doesn't tend to get any longer than the leaf blade, whereas in the next species to the right, the intermediate wintergreen, which is less common still, the leaf stalk can actually get longer. It's about as long or slightly longer, as long as or slightly longer than the leaf blade. The leaf blade tends to be a bit rounder in the intermediate wintergreen, but there's a bit of overlap there. So another thing we can look at is the number of teeth along each side of the leaf, and you tend to get no more than about 16 per side in the intermediate wintergreen, but you can get more than 16 in the common wintergreen. There's also differences in the flowers. I shouldn't really tell you this, but I just paused before saying that. Put the recording on pause so I could get out the book and just check. We can't remember everything, can we? And I tend to do so much by the leaves, as you can actually identify these species by the leaves with those teeth and everything. But if you've got the flowers there, that's some more clues. And I tend to use, in some species, use the flower features so little that they don't stick in my memory as well as the leaf features. Anyway, if you've got flowers in these species, if it's the intermediate wintergreen, you're more likely to see those projecting styles, as we call it, the part of a female part of the plant, sticking out downwards beyond the end of the petals of the flower, whereas they're shorter, up to, in fact I'll read here out of the book, they're only 1 to 2 millimeters long and not projecting beyond the corolla, the petals really, in the ordinary common wintergreen, whereas they're 4 to 6 millimeters projecting beyond it in Pyrola media, the intermediate wintergreen. I'm reading that out of the Collins Flower Guide. It's a very good book. Yeah, so that's those two species. Serrated wintergreen. See the leaf of that? Talking about leaves again, it's all leaves, really is often the way to do these. The leaves of that look a bit like leaves of bilberry, blaeberry. They're more of an oval, slightly pointy tipped leaf compared with the two species on the left, those two other wintergreens. And they've got lots of little teeth, more clearly visible teeth than they are in the other two, in the pyrola species. So it's quite a different leaf, relatively longer and narrower, rather shorter stalked as well. So you can always tell it by those leaf features. The leaves look basically kind of like blaeberry leaves. Again, it's not very common. You get it on rocky ground quite a lot of the time. If you do find it, it's on rocky ground, but sometimes it goes right on the forest floor. One-flowered wintergreen. Sometimes I thought they should call it one is fun, you know, because you've got spikes of flowers, loads of flowers and so many things, I don't know, foxgloves and whatever, with loads of things, all showy. But you don't need, because there's that cookery book, isn't there? One is fun. You don't need lots. It's a nice flower. It comes up on a very simple stalk, very elegant, very. It's a very small plant, this one. Round leaves with lots of rather pointed teeth along their edges, and the leaves just down at the very bottom of the plant. So it's quite distinctive, actually, even in leaf. It's a very rare plant of pine woods. And here on the second page of these pine wood specialities, we got twin flower first. Very easy thing to recognise because it's got these trailing stems. It kind of form patches. They can sort of trail around all over the place. And along the stems you get little oval leaves in opposite pairs. And then when the flowers come up, you get, as you can see there, a stalk comes up and divides into two. Hence the name twin flower. It's really, really distinctive. And it's a very uncommon plant of pine woods. The creeping lady's tresses, that's a kind of orchid, has spikes. They look a bit, I don't know, they don't look very purposeful somehow, the spikes of creeping lady's tresses, the flower spikes. But they're okay, yeah. The leaves, if anything, are maybe a bit more distinctive because they're very smooth, hairless leaves and slightly translucent, no teeth along the edges, and they come in these rosettes. Yeah, they've got a funny dull, slightly olivey colour and a sort of funny translucency about them. Really very, very distinct, and parallel veins. So I don't think you're really going to mistake that for anything. Very often you see it with just the leaves and no flowers anyway. And if you haven't got flowers, I'm slightly inclined to say you haven't missed that much, but no, they're nice. I did see some the other a few years ago with a whole load of flower spikes someplace up near Inverness. So usually when I've seen that species, I've not seen the flowers. But yeah, it was quite a happy thing to see a whole load of flowering spikes. Lesser twayblade. Well, if you're looking for dull flowers, especially in orchids, maybe that's even better contender for sort of most boring looking orchid flowers. Brown, very small. It's a very small orchid, this one, really, really little thing. But there's a nice delicacy to those flowers. They're not really boring. And the closer you look, there's more patterns there. So it's quite a beautiful little thing. And the leaves, it's easy to tell because the leaves just come in a pair at the base of the flower stem. And the individual leaves, they're pretty small. They're in a way, they're smaller than you might think looking at that photo. The leaves are about the same size as bilberry leaves. I don't know, just thinking what size it might be. A centimetre long, maybe. There's 1 to 2 centimetres long, something like that. Just a straight oval leaf, but in pairs, like that. And then the flower stalk coming out. Sometimes you see it with just the leaves, just a pair of leaves. It grows amongst sphagnum moss under heather. That's its main habitat. So it can be in damp pine woodland, but also, in fact, more commonly in damp kaluna, heather-dominated heaths and very heathy bogs. And in all of those places, blaeberry or bilberry can grow as well. So when we're looking for lesser twayblade, it's usually a case of distinguishing between the leaves of the lesser twayblade and the leaves of the vaccinium, the blaeberry. Okay, things change on this page because these are the species classed as negative indicators in the pine and juniper habitat. Negative in that they might suggest that something ain't right. So stinging nettle and creeping thistle, these are two species that you can get in places where there's been some nutrient enrichment. And in the case of the thistle, some ground disturbance, maybe trampling by livestock. So those are things that can affect the environment in ways that either they can cause direct disturbance, in the case of the trampling or vehicle tracks as well, actually, for those kind of things on the ground where thistles can thrive, or as far as nutrient enrichment is concerned, that can be encouraging these plants like nettle and some thistles and goosegrass, that's also illustrated in the nettle photograph there, encouraging those things to grow bigger and thicker and to dominate more at the expense of other smaller plants that can't compete with them. Bracken as well, actually, as far as competition is concerned, that's the thing that can just grow and grow and thicken up and cover big areas, and the annual laying down of old bracken litter that can build up in a thick mat on the ground and swamp everything else out. So yeah, it can do that both in woodland and out in the open as well. Rhododendron, of all the species on this page, I think the most serious problem in not just pine woodland, pine and juniper habitat, but woodland in Britain in general, has got to be rhododendron. Awful thing in that it grows big and dense, quite a few meters tall, and thickens up, great thickets of the stuff, and the leaves are so big and evergreen that they cast heavy shade on the ground, and they're pretty toxic, I think, as well. You know, when they do fall on the ground, to form a layer that smothers everything. Disastrous thing, and it does particularly well in western broadleaved woods that are so important for other things like mosses and liverworts and lichens. Yeah, serious problem, rhododendron. It's quite right for it to be featuring here on the list of NPMS negative indicators. Well, after the dark miseries of the rhododendron, what better thing to do than to look on the bright side, really, at some things that are not necessarily officially part of the NPMS system, but they're just things of interest in the pine woods. And look at that lovely golden coloured moss, Tylium christocastrensis. I can never remember what they call the English name of it, because I tend to use Latin names, find them simpler actually, but others will disagree. Anyway, whatever you call it, I call it Tylium. It's a lovely moss that grows on the acid woodland floor, not just in native pine woods, but also in broadleaved woods in the north especially, and in some heaths as well, north-facing heaths. Beautiful moss with these lots and lots of branches on both sides, quite a thick stem. The individual leaves are very curly. This main stem is quite stiff, and all these things stick up out of the ground. It's quite unmistakable. One of the specialities, as I say, not NPMS. NPMS doesn't actually deal with mosses, but that's still hopefully of interest for me to show you this thing. Another aspect of sort of general interest is the way the ground vegetation, the species composition of the ground flora can vary in relation to how dry the soil is, how dry the habitat is. So here's a south-facing bit of pine woodland, native pine wood, well-drained ground, soils are quite thin. There's a lot of bell heather there, a species that does like it on the dry side. It's still quite mossy. The more sort of moist and north facing and shaded it gets, the more mossy the whole habitat tends to be. But even for a south, even considering this is on a south facing slope here, reasonably well lit, still quite a lot of moss, which reflects the relatively cool and moist climate of the upland areas of Britain in which we find the pine juniper habitat. But then when we go onto a north-facing slope, this is some north-facing pine and birch wood in the West Highlands, where it's a rainier climate altogether, because that previous photograph was sort of central Highlands really. This is quite a bit further west, near Loch Arkaig actually. So it's north-facing, really wet sort of environment. And not surprising to find an awful lot of moss growing among the heather, very great luxuriant deep cushions of moss, including these big red patches of Sphagnum capitifolium. People often think, and quite rightly actually, that sphagnum mosses as a rule tend to be in wet places. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're just restricted to kind of flat, squelchy bits of like bogs or basin mires, that kind of place. We can actually find them on steep slopes, north-facing, steeply sloping, north-facing ground, because the slope aspect means it doesn't get that much light, especially when there are trees there as well, and tall heather kind of keeps the whole habitat pretty humid. So there's quite a different mix of species to what we saw in the previous photograph. Some species in common, heather, for example, and some of the commoner mosses. But there's also Molinia, the purple moorgrass, there in the bottom left corner of this photo. So it's altogether a wetter, sort of cooler and wetter habitat. The bottom photo on this page also has a lot of purple moorgrass. It's not purple in this photograph or the previous one, by the way. It's that pale buff colour. The leaves, the long leaves of these tussocks of this grass, they go kind of beautiful buff colour in the autumn, and they stay very pale through the winter. So it's an easily recognisable species. And so there's some more wettish pinewood. The other photo, top right photo, is drier, a bit more like the one a couple of pages back, the dry pinewood with bell heather and so on. But this is a more grazed example, so it's more grassy. The dwarf shrub cover's been reduced. There is some blaeberry, I think a bit of heather maybe as well actually in there, but it's generally, yeah, there is some heather. It's much more grassy. It fits that similar pattern that we find in the broadleaf woods, that the more grazed it is, the more grassy it is, less on the very acid soils, less grazed, more heathy. So there's grazed grassy pinewood. Here's something different. This is pine woodland in which the ground layer has just a huge abundance of cladonia lichens of the genus Cladonia, that are sort of whitish, creamy colour, and they're very branched. There are some other cladonias that are much less branched and kind of a duller, browner colour, or there are a whole range of shapes actually, many species of cladonia, but the most conspicuous ones are these big branched ones like Cladonia portentosa, Cladonia arbuscula, and others. And yeah, in some places in northeast Scotland, they can absolutely carpet the ground like this. It looks like snow or some kind of frosting of lichens. You don't see this very often, but you do see something more extensively, more commonly than this, something similar in Scandinavia. So this is a kind of glimpse of that boreal Scandinavian lichen-rich pine forest that we can see this glimpse of just in a few places in the northeast of Scotland. I mentioned snow in the previous slide, and I was likening the lichens. It's a funny thing to say actually, isn't it? Likening the lichens. Anyway, I was likening the lichens to a sort of dusting of snow. But here we see the effects of real snow, in that the weight of snow that's come down in a snowy winter and been held by the pine foliage has eventually got too heavy for the branch to support it, and branches are broken off. This was in the Blackwood of Rannoch, but I've seen similar things elsewhere, even just up the road from me here in East Lothian, that in snowy conditions you can get these big branches come off, and that kind of must play a role in shaping individual trees, and thereby kind of playing some part in shaping the structure of the forest. So it's another interesting aspect of the ecology of these places. Apparently insects also play a part in shaping the structure of the pine trees, the sort of branching and everything. I was told this by a guy years ago who was an entomologist. I don't know actually exactly what it was that the insects were doing to kind of shape the pine trees, something to do with their behaviour, their feeding, eating buds or whatever. Anyway, yeah, snow, effects of snow. Here, I just thought I'd put this one in as another example of how snow can shape things in a very big way. This is over in Japan, in northern Japan, where they get such a lot of snow, incredible, tremendous quantities of snow lying deep for about 3 or 4 months through the winter. And you see those slanting birch trees, Betula manii. From our perspective in Britain, we would think, oh, that must be wind that's causing them to go like that. But no, it's the weight of snow, the sheer weight of the snow as the main thing. They do get some wind playing a bit of a role, but yeah, quite fascinating to see. So what we have with these pines, some of the branches breaking off, and in that way, snow playing a bit of a part, probably in the structure of the woodland. We can see that as part of a pattern that we can then trace to something more extreme in other parts of the world. I just put this picture in here to show the old dead fallen pine, you know, the trunks, the branches, standing trunks with a bit of bark, a mixture of bark, rough bark and other sort of just decorticated trunk, and then all the fallen stuff, various stages of decay, important habitats for mosses, liverworts, lichens and insects. So important in the way that they form, the fallen ones form part of this whole structure of what's on the ground, not just the vegetation, but you've also got the ups and downs of the ground itself, and then other things like fallen dead wood, which affects the local sort of micro habitats, you can call them, and thereby the microclimate as well, local increases in shade and shelter and humidity. So the deadwood's important stuff, and there are quite a few kind of specialities, uncommon, rarish things found on dead pine. This one here is the first of a few pictures I've put in of juniper scrub, because we haven't seen that many pictures in this presentation of the juniper scrub habitat yet, so here we are. As you can see, it can be quite dense, and quite a striking feature of the juniper scrub, in so many examples of it anyway, is the contrasting growth forms of the juniper bushes themselves. Some of them are quite sort of fastigiate, that one in the middle, like a Lombardy poplar, others growing in a more spreading form. So I've got a few pictures of these. So next one here, there's a lot of spreading bushes here, this site in Perthshire, and then some tall, not particularly columnar ones in the background, but just taller and more upright. Here's some in the Lake District. The Lake District is a pretty good area for juniper scrub. There's lots of it, which is one of the ways in which the Lake District really differs from North Wales, which in so many other respects is very, very similar, but you don't get the juniper scrub in North Wales. So yeah, there's some more, a mix of upright bushes and lower spreading ones. And one more here. You know, it almost looks a bit like a kind of garden, some sort of a planted shrubbery, you know, where they've kind of got things and maybe cut them, pruned them, or whatever to grow in different shapes. But you know, it just does this naturally. And this one here, this isn't quite so garden-like, but it's an example of juniper scrub in a place that's really pretty heavily grazed. See that very short ground vegetation, short grassy dwarf shrubs. There would probably be dwarf shrubs in there if it wasn't so grazed. There's dwarf shrubs further beyond. That's on more peaty ground where the vegetation won't be so much of a sort of nutrient-rich bite for the animals. But here, on what looks like a bit of mineral soil, there'll be a bit of a more nutritious vegetation for them, and they've been eating away there and grazed it right down to a short and mossy grassland. And this is a close-up of a much less heavily grazed bit of juniper scrub. So the heathy element is doing very well there. A lot of vaccinium, the blaeberry, such a palatable species. If those animals could get in there, they would have been eating a lot of that down. But actually some things has been in there. You see that broad buckler fern frond towards the bottom of the picture, just left of centre, that's been bitten off at the top, probably by deer, and but not very heavily grazed. So the other fern fronds, including the hard fern just to the right of centre, is in pretty decent condition. That's a very palatable species, and it's not been bitten back, not yet anyway. Here are some closer views of ferns that have been grazed. Again, really by deer more than by sheep, I think, in the places where I found and photographed these. On the left, broad buckler fern, bitten off at the top, just like the one in the previous photo. I don't think it's the same animal that did that. It's several miles distance between the two sites, although actually, of course, the animals can roam a long way. The middle photo, there's some male fern. The current year's growth, the brighter, paler yellow or green, and the previous year's growth, the darker green. The previous year's growth being bitten right back almost to the central stalk. They, eating away at the individual side pinnae, rather than biting the whole thing off at the top. And the right-hand one is hard fern, which has an altogether narrower frond, so it'll be a bit more fiddly for the animals to sort of try eating it away from the sides, and much easier for them just to bite the whole thing off the top. So that's the effect that you see on hard fern, varying at various points. Sometimes it's just a tip bitten, sometimes you find a hard fern in which almost the whole thing has been bitten away, probably multiple times from the top down, and there's very, very little left of it. I should mention that these are all tufted ferns that are very palatable to the large herbivores, sheep and deer, for example. Bracken, on the other hand, is not at all palatable to these animals, so we don't see these sort of effects on bracken. So just as I was finishing off the narration for that last slide, the door in this room opened and my daughter came in with some chocolate ice cream, which is sitting on the table in front of me now. I've just had a spoonful. I put the thing on pause while I had a spoonful of this, and it really is jolly good. So maybe I'll have to rush through these last 3 slides before it melts. This is a picture I drew of a juniper bush just up the hill from here to show the kind of sculptural twisted sort of forms they have, and those can be especially evident or striking on bushes that are in quite dry places, so you haven't got a whole big growth of mosses and liverworts and lichens over those stems. You just see these sort of pale stems bare like that, almost like bone, really. Amazing things to look at. In contrast to this one, which is equally amazing to look at, it's a big old juniper in the highlands, and it's a wetter climate there, and its actual, topographically speaking, its location is much more humid. You see all the mossy vegetation all around, great amounts of mosses and liverworts. That purplish stuff growing on the stems there is a liverwort called Frulania tamarisci, and various kinds of mosses growing in there. Incredible. So yeah, that sculptural form of it isn't so evident, and whilst one might say that aesthetically speaking maybe it's not so striking, there's actually so much going on in there. We could spend quite a long time checking out those mosses and liverworts and lichens and finding it jolly interesting, at least those of us who are interested in such things. And that brings us to this last slide, on which I've just put some illustrations of pine and juniper, closer up illustrations of twigs and leaves, and the cones there of the pine. One thing I hadn't mentioned until now, I'm mentioning it now, to do with Scots pine. I've probably been kind of taking it for granted that you know how to identify the species, its growth form, the look of the trees with those sort of blobby loads of foliage up there, and a rather irregular growth form compared to spruces and firs. it may seem easy in that respect, but there are other pines. Lodgepole pine is similar size. In lodgepole pine, the leaves are duller. They're not such a bluey tinge, tinted green, and the trunk doesn't have those bits of orangey red or reddish brown colour that you get so often on Scots pine. It's more kind of dull greyish brown through and through. And the cones of lodgepole pine, the outside parts of the scales can very commonly have distinct bristles, quite pointy bristles sticking out from them. So it looks really very different. That's not the same as bristlecone pine, by the way, which is a completely different thing, which we don't get here. But lodgepole pine is an introduced species from America, but it's very commonly planted in upland areas. Another one is Corsican pine. A bit of a bigger, can be quite a bigger tree in some respects than the Scots pine. Greyer bark again, and the leaves are much longer. The really long leaves, Corsican pine, are a very distinct feature. And the juniper picture there showing those leaves in whorls of 3, and the young berries, which will eventually be a kind of dark bluey colour, about the same colour as blaeberries. So I hope you found some interest or useful information from this presentation, and then that it helps you with any NPMS work that you may be doing. So with that, I'll from me and this chocolate ice cream here, which is looking very good, I will say goodbye.